Welcome, everybody. Great to see everybody. A huge crowd here today and a whole bunch of guests. Today, we're going to be talking words of the year and the words that made 2020 oh so special. We have with us a panel from the American Dialect Society, from Merriam-Webster, dictionary.com, Oxford Languages, all of which chose words of the year. Well, except Oxford Language, they kind of cheated and just said, well, there are so many words. We're going to talk to all of them. We're going to have a couple of extra special guests too dropping in. And if you have questions, as Heather said, ask the question in the chat, and we'll try to ask you to unmute to answer it. But also, at some point, if all works out, we'll try to give everybody a chance to weigh in. So you can send Heather a note and say, I want to defend this word. I think this is the word that should have been the word of the year. And we'll give you a forum to speak. We'll probably cut you off after 30 seconds. But the goal is to finish all in an hour. So we'll jump right in. I'm going to start with Ben Zimmer. So the American Dialect Society, I think, he can correct me if I'm wrong, is the organization that sort of started the whole idea, the concept of doing a word of the year. So they're the oldest and the grandest, the only one that's not actually a dictionary it's a professional organization. Ben this is Ben's third time on the show. He's our most frequent guest. He was a guest for a show about him, and we did a show about where we did a whole bunch of games, and now we're doing words. Ben is he has a regular column at the Wall Street Journal where he writes about words or phrases in the news, so he kind of keeps track of this stuff. And he's also the Word of the Year guru for the American Dialect Society. And I was there, Ben, for that raucous online meeting where people debated and chose the word. It was great excitement. So, Ben, what is the American Dialect Society Word of the Year and why?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me back yet again. Glad you're not sick of me yet. So yeah, we had our Word of the Year selection for the first time online, first time in the 30-year history of the American Dialect Society picking a Word of the Year. We're the oldest, as far as I know, for English language words of the year. There's some talk of a German language word of the year that might have preceded us, but yes, it is the sort of the granddaddy of the Word of the Year selections for English. And so this year, after some very interesting online discussion, the vote came down to a number of interesting finalists. Words like doom scrolling and pandemic and social distancing. We'll be hearing lots about those words, I think, today. But the one that people voted on for Word of the Year for 2020 is COVID, short for COVID-19, which in turn is short for Coronavirus Disease 2019. And that was the name of the disease that was given by the World Health Organization way back in February. They came up with COVID-19. People very quickly started shortening that just to COVID. And so that 5-letter acronym, which is unavoidable now, of course, it was completely meaningless just a year ago. That has come to dominate our lives in so many ways. And so the people who joined to vote, and I know that many of the people here actually participated. I see some familiar names in the participant list. Ultimately, the voters decided that COVID is what best summed up the zeitgeist of 2020.
And I thought early in the year, my early prediction was social distancing, which was, what everybody was talking about, a new concept, I think, and that comes up in some other words of the year in other countries. But I don't know, maybe it just peaked too early, and in the end, it was it also ran, I suppose.
Right.
I submitted, because I was able to participate, I submitted a few suggestions, and one of them was 2020, which I really didn't think was, the word of the year. But then I got caught up in the whole excitement of the moment of this debate and discussion, and people said, gosh, there's so much more to the year than just the coronavirus, COVID-19, and there was sort of this movement to pick a word that sort of encapsulated everything, which was the impeachment, the election, anything election or Trump related. Doom scrolling was one that was popular, but I liked the 2020, and it was a fairly close.
Yeah, that ended up being the second place nominee in the overall Word of the Year category. We'll get into all the other categories later on, I think, but for that final vote, it came down to a runoff between COVID and 2020, and people like Mark were arguing for 2020, even though it's the name of the year. It's being used like a lexical item. You can even say that's, things were so 2020, or because 2020 is an excuse that you might have heard.
Hashtag so 2020.
Yes, and if someone pointed out, it could even be used as an infix, as in abso 2020 lutely. So there are a lot of reasons to go for that one, but yeah, COVID ended up edging it out in the end.
Okay, really quickly, we'll get to Merriam-Webster next, but really quickly, what's the criteria? Because it seems to me that the American Dialect Society choice doesn't really fit the dictionary's criteria, and the dictionary criteria doesn't necessarily fit well, I suppose you could have done their choice, but what's the criteria for American Dialect Society?
Yeah, I mean, we do have our own criteria, and generally what we're looking for is a word or a phrase, anything that can be considered a lexical item, that is new or newly prominent. So it doesn't have to be brand new, it just has to be notable in some way over the past year. Sometimes what ends up winning is a word that has been around for a long time that has a change of usage. So, that's what we look at. So, there were lots of great nominations that we got hundreds of nominations from people when we asked people to nominate words as they signed up. Got some really great choices, and there were a lot of brand new words that had never been heard before 2020. COVID, of course, is one of them. But then there were other choices that, we could have gone for. Social distancing is one of them. That didn't suddenly become, a new phrase in 2020, but it certainly was extremely prominent. And I would have guessed that, might have won going in if I was going to bet on one. But yeah, so those are our criteria. The dictionaries have their own ways of doing it, though.
Okay. All right. So we're going to ask Peter Sokolowski the criteria at Merriam-Webster, how they chose their word. Peter is editor at large for Merriam-Webster. He was hired as the lead on the dictionary's first French dictionary. He's contributed to the Collegiate, the Advanced Learners Dictionary. He's also a panelist on a new Merriam-Webster podcast, Word Matters, which is tons of fun. Peter, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you. Happy New Year. It's good to see so many friends here. And I think I'm the only person who's actually met all the panelists, because obviously Ben and I are old friends, and Katherine used to live in New York. But I've also spent time with John, which I think is unique among us, and Lynne, of course.
Well, John and I have already made plans for coffee in Bexley. But
it makes me feel good. I think a piece of my, such as it is, a piece of my job seems to be the kind of a diplomat for the dictionary, and I think it makes sense that I've met all of you, and I know, right. And also the hi to all my other friends. I see Marilyn, Henry, and Wendy, and Jonathan, and Mary, and Jamie. Thank you, all of you. But to get to the criteria, obviously the American Dialect Society is the granddaddy of this tradition, and I think the tradition of having that fun, of having word experts kind of, hash it out, is terrific. And I think that's exactly why we don't do that. I think there's a good reason to show what we have, that not everybody has, which is a lot of data and the evidence that people leave behind when they come to the dictionary, which is something that has fascinated me for years. What makes a person look up a word? What sends somebody to the dictionary? But it also leaves, of course, a digital trace so that we can count how many times each word has been consulted and looked up. And also, of course, when. And many of you know that in real time, we can post our trending words. And this idea of trending, I remember I've been dealing with our dictionary data since about 2002. We went online with the online dictionary for free in 1996. But in the early years, 02, 03, 04, I would have to explain to journalists what trending meant. I'd have to say, well, when a lot of people go, and I won't bother with you, but today, because that was before Google, and now we all sort of think that way. And now I have to explain to journalists that no, we're not naming Google's most looked up word. We're naming Merriam-Webster's most looked up word, the people who came to our website. It's our data. Although there may be interesting overlaps and interesting ways to look at different rubrics of the word of the year. So for us, obviously this year, the word was pandemic. And that's no big surprise. I think that when I think back to, for example, 2008 or 2009, the word of the year that year was bailout. Following on the news of the Great Recession. But the thing is, we don't refer back to that period as the bailout. However, I think lexicographers make lousy prognosticators, by the way, but I do guess that we will look back on 2020 as the pandemic. I think that will be, children will be known as pandemic children, or, Depression era habits are still things we talk about and that, that have affected generations. And I think that's exactly what we have here. Pandemic is interesting because we saw going back sort of forensically, I went to look at the data, and the very first glimmer, the first time it spiked upward a little bit was in early January. And that was the same day that the first case was reported. I believe it was January 20th. In America. And then the real spike up was on February 3rd, which was the day that first case was released from a Seattle hospital. But then, and then from that point, there was a steady kind of drumbeat of interest in this word until, of course, March 11th, when the WHO declared the disease a pandemic, and we saw an astronomical spike of something like 116,000% over the previous year's lookups. And so clearly that was a huge spike and a spike of interest, but there are other words and other stories that spiked interest in vocabulary. However, what we found with pandemic was, even though other terms like quarantine sank over time, pandemic stayed high. It didn't stay at that all-time peak, but it stayed, relatively speaking, very high throughout the year. So in raw terms, it was a word that we could claim easily as the word of the year. And just to give you some insight, we look at our spikes and we look at the raw data of which words were looked up the most, but then we compare that list with the previous years, the year over year data, which is to say that we look at words that were spiking in 2020 that were not spiking in 2019. The reason we do this is because dictionary traffic is heavy, and a lot of the words that we look up in the dictionary are words that are looked up day in and day out, year in and year out. We call them evergreen words. These are words like affect and effect, or integrity, or paradigm, or ubiquitous, or love. The word love is a very highly looked up word. And those are words that tell us a lot about the difficulties of the English language, but not a lot about what was special about 2020.
Right. Yeah, I've often wondered, you must get a lot of words that spike for various reasons that don't necessarily have any cultural resonance.
Absolutely.
Maybe just a word. I mean, you do some spiked words, some trending words that you'll see on a daily basis, and it's because somebody in the news used a word that wasn't used before, things like that. And so you probably in some years you have to sort of sort through that. Imagine this year, it sounds like pandemic was just so clearly there.
Sure. I mean, and in fact, Mark, do you have that graphic? Can you put that up? Do you have the screen grab or the tweet from 2009?
The tweet from your tweet. Yeah, I do.
And this is just a coincidence, but I think it tells. It helps tell the whole story, actually, of how we do it and what it is that we do online with the online dictionary. I was assigned Twitter as the kind of public editor in 2009, and I had never heard of it. I didn't know what it was about. Our marketing director, who's a brilliant woman, signed me up to claim my name, and then said, go online and, you know, give information about behind the scenes at the dictionary. And I remember this, I don't remember everything, but I remember this particular day very clearly, because behind the scenes at the dictionary is pretty dull. Because I was working, I would write monthly reports on the data, on the words that were being looked up, and that was mostly for in-house purposes. I walked down to the office of the president of Merriam-Webster, his name was John Moores, and I just said, you know, because we often talked about the data, and I just said, you know, because it's spiking in a way that reflects the news, could I present this on Twitter? Could I announce these words on Twitter that we had prior sort of assumed were kind of proprietary information? And he didn't hesitate. He said, sure. So this tweet was that tweet. The very first tweet that I ever made about a trending word happened to be the word pandemic. In May of 2009, that was the H1N1 crisis. And, you know, here we are coming full circle to a place and a point where the Trend Watch first started as tweets by me. And then about a year later, we added a kind of page to the homepage at Merriam-Webster.com to show the trending words kind of on a weekly basis. And now we have facilities to make them as fast as they come at us. And sometimes, as you know, during, for example, presidential debates, we'll have you know, 10 or a dozen of these trend watches posted in the course of one evening. Our little team working furiously on Slack in front of TVs and laptops everywhere. But anyway, I just think it's interesting that the word pandemic happens to be the one that started the whole idea of making trending words from a dictionary part of our public story.
Right. And so and you got 11 whole likes and 2 retweets.
Actually, no, I think a lot of those likes came from when I retweeted it just recently. I think it had 2. Oh, yeah. I think it originally had 2.
Okay, yeah, I see that. All right, and so so maybe it's not surprising. Often when we see the list of words of the year, you'd think that all the lexicographers would come up with the same word, but usually you see a variety of words. This year is a little different. It's usually pretty much all over the world are about the same topic, which it's kind of interesting that all over the world. I mean, it's different languages or experiences the same thing, but we have one case where dictionary.com looked at the data in a similar way and came up with the same word, pandemic. So we have John Kelly here to talk about dictionary.com and what was the process there. John is senior editor at dictionary.com. He looks at slang, trending words, word histories, with a love, he says, for unlocking the power of words in culture and education. So John Kelly. John turns out John Kelly's brother, I think, lives in my town, Bexley. So we have met. He's been on the show before. We've not yet met in person, but we're planning to rectify that at some point.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. I hope to meet all of you in person, should 2021 permit. The unprecedented, shall I say, happened in 2020. 2 dictionaries chose the same word on the same day. How incredible is that? Peter, I would love to have seen your reaction. I'm sure you could have imagined ours. And then we leaned back and went, yeah, because 2020, because the pandemic. What other word could it be? 2020 was the year of the pandemic. Peter mentioned a lot of the data that goes behind their selection of word of the year. We do a similar process where we look up, we research the top lookups, and pandemic surged massively in a similar timeline, spiking that same day on March 11th when the Director General of the World Health Organization declared not lightly that COVID-19 was officially a pandemic. And we also saw that month over month, compared to year over year, the search traffic, the search interest in the word pandemic remained high, whereas quarantine, social distancing, coronavirus, COVID-19, all of those and many other words dropped off. Other data points that we look at are what the word of the year says about the work we did as a dictionary as a whole, and what the word of the year says about the culture, back to some of the zeitgeist issues that Ben was talking about. I know Merriam saw this too, but the pandemic set off lexicographical work from, editorial articles to, more importantly, all sorts of new dictionary entries or updated dictionary entries that is so rare in lexicography, which is often a slow business. So we were looking at all the updates we had to do, from brand new words like COVID to new senses like aerosolized, to new fun phrases or fun phrases like the before times or doom scrolling. And the pandemic kept on underscoring those. It was the word that most powerfully captured this whole body of work, this whole new shared vocabulary that we all suddenly developed. And it was an incredible thing. We were all suddenly talking like Dr. Fauci in a very short period of time, and lexicographers were just, it was their moment in the spotlight, shall we say. One of the nicer parts of 2020. And the pandemic also set off a lot of slang and colloquial activity that a lot of us were documenting. I think the American Dialect Society vote certainly highlighted things like quarren as a combining form, COVID almost as a kind of attributive noun / combining form, similar things for corona. And so we all developed not only a shared technical vocabulary where herd immunity and contact tracing we could, riddle off the top of our tongues, but also we're trying to capture what this lived experience was like, from all the ways that Zoom fatigued us to all the ways that the coronavirus prevented our haircuts. So we have the hard data points in terms of dictionary lookups, and then we supplement that with what best captures the work we did as a dictionary and what best captures what overrides 2020. And I agree with Peter. Very, very seldom are you going to have a word like pandemic. I'll put it this way. It's the obvious choice, but think about how profound it is that it became the obvious choice. I can't stop thinking about conversations I had with my friends who have younger children, and they gathered their kids around the dinner table and had to teach them a word like pandemic. Peter mentioned that you've got words that are looked up often throughout the year. Culture, science, independent variable, those sorts of perennial evergreen words. Pandemic is sometimes pretty high too, because it comes up in science classes, history classes, and the like. But that it became such an important part of our everyday vocabulary that something like before the pandemic or pandemic baking or getting a pandemic puppy was meaningful. That is why we had to settle on pandemic as the obvious but profound choice for 2020.
Mm-hmm. Okay, terrific. And then, and there clearly there's the pandemic, but there's so many words. COVID also encapsulates that, and there are so many other words that come from that pandemic experience. So Oxford Dictionaries usually picks a word of the year, and this year they punted and said, you know what, there's not just one word. They did a 38-page report on the words of the year, which is really great reading. We're going to have a link for you in the chat. So new to the show, Katherine Martin is at a disadvantage because she hasn't been on the show like all the other lexicographers here. Katherine is head of products at Oxford Dictionary. Previously, she was head of the U.S. Dictionary for Oxford. She's an American living in England, and Katherine, I have to ask you, was it really that you couldn't decide, or what was it? Sort of, I don't think you probably can't even see that with the lighting, but it's the title of this is Oxford Languages 2020 Words of an unprecedented year, unprecedented in bold. Is it a secret signal that you really were choosing unprecedented?
I will admit to you, Phil, first, thank you very much for having me. It's such a joy to be seeing all of the editorial and lexicographical folks from America again, having been over in England for just a little over a year now, and obviously kind of trapped here. But I will reveal for the first time that yes, indeed, it was suggested that unprecedented would be a choice, and we did notice that the word has been used a lot in the context of this year, and it did show a rise in usage in our corpora, but that just didn't seem momentous enough. It didn't seem right. And to explain why we ended up producing a 38-page report, I think it is helpful to look at what the criteria are for the Oxford Word of the Year. So Oxford, being the home of the OED, is all about diachronic lexical change, meaning how the lexicon changes over time. That's our bread and butter. That's what we're looking at all the time. And we take the really long view. We take the 1,000-year view on the history of the English language. And in recent years, we've really tried to, when we're looking at our word of the year, to think about it from the perspective of highlighting some aspect of language change that we think is evidenced in a word that also shows, like in some way reflects the ethos of that year. And so often that has been a neologism like selfie or vape, post-truth, but it hasn't always been. Sometimes it's been something like a new word that's taking on unexpected new collocations and is becoming more prominent in different contexts, like toxic. And we have even once before chosen a non-word, which was when we selected the face with tears of joy emoji in 2015. And we deliberately that year, the reason we chose that was because we were trying to look at how the English language's development was going hand in hand with these non-linguistic elements like GIFs and emoji, and they were increasingly being used in these online contexts and kind of mixing up with English. So we've played fast and loose before, but this was definitely the year that I would say we did the equivalent of when Time magazine made the person of the year a mirror. Just like the trick that you can only pull once.
Okay.
People who are younger may not remember this, but it was like I think this was at the height of like Web 2.0. Time magazine was like, right. Oh, it was all about people on the internet this year. So the word of the year is just you, and the cover was a mirror. So this year, the reason we did that is because we were talking about all the different possibilities, and things like COVID and pandemic and unmute even were mentioned, and and we looked at all of them and it was like, but that's not really the story. And what we felt looking at it was like, actually the story is the scope. The story is the breadth. The story is how suddenly being a lexicographer seems really intense and important in a way that it doesn't usually feel, because there's something that's going on about this year in language change that is more immense than usual. And so we look at a lot of statistics too. And but the statistics that we look at for our word of the year are different. Because we're interested in tracking diachronic change, we look at the data that we collect to inform decisions about what words to add to the dictionary or how to change our descriptions of meaning in the dictionary. And so when we're looking at frequency, it's the relative frequency of a given word in a corpus that we keep that's mainly drawn from media sources on the internet. So every month we collect this data, and we try to be very balanced about the sources that are coming in and what country they come from, so that we can compare one month and another and see how things change. So we stepped back and said, it seems like something's different this year. Can we empirically show that there's something different? And the 38-page report is kind of our attempt to grapple with that. And I don't, it's an impossible question to answer, but we came away feeling like this year, 2020, if we were looking for comparable things, we found ourselves looking at the world wars, where you have this just like global cataclysmic event that touches everyone in the world. It changes what we're talking about. It creates new lexical gaps, but it also fundamentally changes the metaphors that we use. It changes the, not to misuse an epidemiological metaphor, it changes the transmission vectors. So in the same way that in like World War I, you have people from different parts of the world getting together, interacting in different ways, a French person, an American, and a Brit, all like meeting in the trenches, sharing new words. And we know that words spread that way. Well, the equivalent today, we have the whole world having to talk about the same thing, having these new lexical gaps that are emerging. And because we're all stuck at home and we're not talking to our next door neighbor, we're actually just like interacting with, we're doom scrolling, we're talking to someone in Malaysia on Twitter. That's new transmission vectors. And so we just felt like that's, put up your hands. No single word is big enough to explain what was special about this year in language change, because what was special this year was that it was everything. And we saw, looking at all of the ways, and it's not just COVID, it's things like, we had words that were coming out of racial justice activism, or words that were, the funny, they're always like the funny social words, but they all in some way were connected to this fundamental underlying truth about the year. Or if you look at the election, we have a retronym like mail-in voting, or sorry, like in-person voting. You've never had to say that before. No one ever cared about, no one needed a term in-person voting because there wasn't a contrary thing that you were distinguishing it from. So we just felt like it was everywhere. And we created a lot of verbiage and a lot of, lots of fun graphs to show what we saw going on, and to try to make the case that there was just a profundity and an immensity this year. And it came out in what we were doing too. For the first time ever, the OED.com updated 6 times this year instead of 4, because we felt like we needed to add things. I don't know for a fact, but I would say it's that this may be the shortest time from coinage to entering the OED for any word ever, with COVID-19, which was coined in February and entered the dictionary in, I think, July.
Right. Wow.
So it's, yeah, it was a special year, and we didn't want to limit ourselves to just one story.
Well, let's hope it is unprecedented then in the end. One thing I wanted to mention, all these, we have the links in the chat, and grab those and save them, because all the articles that you see from them, dictionaries choose one word, but unless you're Oxford, and but then they also talk about some other words. So Merriam-Webster, dictionary.com, they don't just have the word of the year, but they have other. Oh, and I forgot to ask John. There's dictionary.com also did a Reader's Choice word of the year, right?
We did. Would anyone care to guess what that winner was? It was unprecedented. I think it's really fascinating and solidifying and reaffirming to listen to Katherine's perspective and Peter and Ben's, because there was an interesting tension in our conversations in-house and with colleagues and with everyone who uses language, is the tension between the gravitas of the entire year and the task of having to pick one word to sum up constitutional crises, racial injustice, deaths on an order we haven't seen before. But at the same time, everyone wants to talk about that more relatable, un-2020 believable, or coronasomnia, or Zoom fatigue, the more fun words.
Right.
And so, you're not going to get it right. You're not going to get it, well, maybe some people didn't get it wrong, but it's incredible to see just how linguistically aware we all are. And I think that underscores Katherine's point about we're at home, we've got points of contact. There's another sort of COVID word. And it's just amazing how astute and how keyed in like never before we all were on language this year. And so unprecedented was interesting for us because we think those submissions came with a pretty big heavy groan, like, oh, unprecedented. I'm so tired of this word. But what does it take for a word like unprecedented to go from that sort of top shelf reserved adjective that you need on special occasions to, bottom shelf, cheap vodka that became a cliche, to use a very bizarre drinking metaphor here. So even the choice of unprecedented from our users alone shows that, yes, we're all tired of unprecedented, but it has this own meta unprecedented place. So how could it be anything else?
And can I add to what John just said? Because there's something, and I'm sure you've all seen this. It strikes me often that words spike in our data when they are used, when they suddenly seem urgent or specific or technical or legal or medical. In other words, a word like pandemic might have been in our general vocabulary, but now there is a very narrow meaning for which we are responsible. And we've seen that before, and we see it all the time with technical or legal or medical terms. And in this case, it had this kind of urgent specificity. And Katherine, it's great to see you. It's great to hear you. But you reminded me also of the speed record, right? Because I'm sure it was a speed record for a lot of dictionaries. For us, the record, and it was beautifully documented in Slate by Stefan Fatsis, who wrote a nice piece. The science editors happened to sit near me in the office, and they were working on terms related to the pandemic in January and February when this stuff started. And then from home, we were all doing our work. And it was determined that there was no reason to hold that work back. And so we added that entry for COVID-19 along with new senses and a lot more information at coronavirus and other things, new sense for social distancing, for example, in 34 days from the coinage of the term. So that's an all-time record. And what's interesting to me is that the previous record was held in 1984 by the word AIDS. And so you see a kind of similarity. These are words that were instantly recognized as being important and being ubiquitous and likely to stick around. I do also want to say that, to John's point, other stories, we had defund in our top 10, and icon, which referred to both Ruth Bader Ginsburg and John Lewis. Ben Zimmer wrote a terrific article in The Atlantic that I recommend to everyone on the updating of the entry for racism that also happened this spring at Merriam-Webster. And that wasn't among our top words, but it was a word that obviously got a lot of attention this year.
Mm-hmm. So let's segue into that, and let's talk about what were some of the other. Peter, you mentioned a few. What were some of the other social justice? American Dialect Society is one just because of the format of inviting everybody into a room and having people hash it out. Those social justice terms are become more aware and maybe come to the fore. What were some of the other social justice terms that we saw that were sort of gave us the zeitgeist for 2021?
Ben?
Well, in the American Dialect Society voting, as we mentioned, there were various categories beyond just the overall word of the year. And one of those categories is most likely to succeed. And the winner in that category was anti-racism. We heard quite a lot about anti-racism this year, particularly with the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter protests. I should mention that Black Lives Matter itself was a previous word of the year. In fact, the first time a hashtag was ever made word of the year by the American Dialect Society was Black Lives Matter. So anti-racism, defined as the practice of actively working to prevent or combat racism, was one that was selected for most likely to succeed. And, there were some other race-related nominees, including in that category, the acronym BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, a relatively new term that in some quarters has been used as opposed to just people of color. But, that one, for instance, generated a lot of interesting debate when we had our online meeting. Various scholars of color, who, some in favor of it, some who didn't think that it really added much to the discussion. And so it was interesting to see, again, just how these issues of race have become so prominent in terms of our sort of our general discourse, the general national conversation, and so we see that, you know, certainly with in the case of a word like anti-racism.
And Ben, just to pick up on your point and to point people back to your Atlantic piece, which I love, and John just mentioned that word systemic. That's an important term for this year for sure, and that was a big part of the update that Merriam-Webster made for the entry for racism. The entry, as it read, clearly did account for structural, governmental, institutional racism. However, it did not use the word systemic, which only has been used with racism and with poverty for about 50 years. That particular entry was drafted earlier than that. And so it was time. It was time to update that entry and use the language that we use every day. And that was the term systemic. And so we had updated the term systemic itself in the dictionary already. But after the pandemic started, we also updated the entry for racism using that word. And I think that's a really important point, John. I'm glad you made it.
Yeah, and I'm sure Peter can speak to this too, and as you can too, Katherine, is there were two moments in terms of epic surges and lookups. You had March, when the pandemic and the reality of going into lockdown became real. We saw lookups in a host of related words, from hydroxychloroquine to lockdown. And then in June, right when the protests after the tragic death of George Floyd happened, you also saw a set of terms spiking in tandem that really illustrated that people are going to the dictionary to understand and reckon with what's going on in their world. Not just sometimes new vocabulary, including defund, which is one of our runners up, in that specific sense it has and came to have this year, but also antebellum, as brands and bands were changing their name. Black Lives Matter, previously a word of the year winner for ADS, trended massively. Cancel culture, fascism, anti-fascism, looting, virtue signaling, martial law, white fragility, a lot of these spiking because a certain you-know-who tweeted them or used them. So again, it was a difficult year because you have these two major moments, and then you got the election. Let's not leave that out. But the choice of the word of the year or words of an unprecedented year is what captures the scope and the gravitas of all that. We landed on pandemic, but that is just the top of all the work all lexicographers have been doing all year for all these amazing trends and developments and languagings, for better or for worse.
John mentioned defund, and in the political word of the year category for the American Dialect Society, the choice was actually abolish/defund. Those two items were treated together in the discussion because they so often appeared together in those debates about the drastic restructuring or reforming of law enforcement that people called for in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. This was a case where semantics became, a very important part of the national debate. What do you mean defund the police? What do you mean abolish the police? Those terms were sometimes used rather hyperbolically. If you sort of drilled down on what does defund mean in this case, we're not talking about taking away all the funds from law enforcement, but rather reallocation. And so sometimes these slogans that use these particular buzzwords were perhaps a bit facile in terms of talking about some very complex issues that came up in the wake of those protests. But yeah, so abolish and defund were kind of those obvious choices in the political category for word of the year.
Yeah, and I think defund actually is a very interesting word because it does mean different things to different people. It's not just for most people will say, no, we're not talking about getting rid of all the money, but then you talk to some people and they say, oh no, we want to defund the police. we want to take away all their funding.
Talking to, but then and then the more hyperbolic versions of that got sort of repurposed or weaponized by the other side of the debate, and we saw that happen in the elections.
Right.
Another word was performative. Was another word that was spiked starting in June.
Performative.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's one that's been used on both sides again, just as Ben said.
Right. So I want to give everyone a chance to weigh in. If you have a pet word that you think is overlooked or you think didn't get full credit, um, send a note to. People are talking in the chat, and that's great. And continue to chat there. And I'm going to ask Heather to maybe call on a couple of people if they want to throw in their words. But first, we've done. So we have all the American dictionary, the active American dictionaries who do a word of the year, which unfortunately is just two, I guess. American Dialect Society. Then we have Oxford, who's got a big presence here. We also, a regular guest is Wendalyn Nichols, good friend of the show, and so I'd like her to. She's from Cambridge. Cambridge Major Dictionary in the UK chose a word of the year. So if she could come on and tell us what that word was, that I'd appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Mark. And
Hey.
sorry for crashing your party. I signed up just to listen, and he invited me to talk for a little bit. So happy to hear my friends. The Cambridge Dictionary online is it's the #1 learner's dictionary on the planet. And actually, it isn't just a British dictionary. In March, we added the entire American equivalent of our Advanced Learners Dictionary. So you can choose your locale, get American or British from us. So, and that level of, but what we focus on is helping people whose native language isn't English learn how to use it. And so we, like all the other online, dictionary folks, absolutely look at spikes and at overall, lookups. And so for us, the word quarantine came out top. And it was the only one to hit in the top 5. It was actually the #1 most looked up word. And in the top 5, it was #4 for overall, for the number of spikes, like the highest spikes. And the thing is that the most looked up, it was #1 looked up after you remove the word dictionary and the word hello, right? So people, they will look up things like the word pronunciation is always the 4th. So when newspapers say, well, why didn't you pick the most looked up word? We say, because it was pronunciation, So quarantine stood out for us, not just because of the pure math, though. For us, we're looking at, well, how are things being used? And what was fascinating, because we update the website every 3 or 4 weeks. So we're adding at least a couple thousand words or new senses every year, along with, fixes and edits and, whatever you might want. And I think it took us it was less than a month to get COVID into the dictionary. And we also did a whole revamp of our approach to, like, the difference between systemic and structural racism, for instance. All of that. I think all of us that monitor language closely, and particularly those of us for whom there's almost a moral duty to help people use language accurately. What a concept for a dictionary, to track when it changes. And so what we saw was a new emergent sense of quarantine, right? Quarantine was always about, you've got something, we're going to stop other people from getting it. But quarantine became used pretty much like lockdown, like a period of time in which you're basically making sure you don't get something, which is it's a new use, right? Lockdown, also, we had to add a second sense of the word lockdown, because it isn't just about, oh, there's a shooter outside, get on your desks. There's that whole sense of lockdown. So for us, because of the combination of the highest usage, but also this new emergent sense, that's what made quarantine be our top word of the year.
Okay, quarantine. And it does seem that looking internationally, quarantine or words related to quarantine are very common throughout the world. The COVID words, the coronavirus words, social distancing words. Where is it? Somewhere has the 1.5 meter society, I think was the word. I can't remember where that came from. The Netherlands, perhaps Belgium. So we do have one person, I think, looking to give us an opinion on words, and we're going to get to one other special guest in a minute. But Heather, who do we have waiting in the wings?
We have Elizabeth, who has a word she'd like to speak to. Elizabeth, do you want to unmute?
Well, I have an interesting to me anecdote in support of pandemic, and I found it so interesting to hear several of our guests talk about the way it became so pervasive. I'm a fan of the writing of Emma Donoghue, who's most known for the book Room, that became a famous movie. She's an Irish-Canadian writer, and her most recent book is called The Pull of the Stars. It's set in Dublin during the 1918 flu pandemic. And like many books that had a similar kind of a theme, it was scheduled to come out late in 2020 and was rushed to come out in the summer of 2020. I heard her interviewed with the Kingston Writers Fest, and an interesting question that was posed to her, she talked about going through this accelerated process of getting the book ready for publication. And she was asked whether, as she was doing her final review in this, the late spring in the midst of the pandemic, was there anything that she had written a year or 2 years earlier that she felt she should go and revise, given the context in which the book would come out? And she thought for quite a bit and said there wasn't anything significant content-wise. She felt proud of the historical research and the way that she'd situated the book in its time. But the only thing she changed was that she had originally used the term epidemic, even though she knew that as a global phenomenon, the 1918 flu had been a pandemic. But she and her editor had thought that no one would understand what pandemic was. It was such a rare word that it would be distracting. So they just used epidemic, and they went back and put pandemic in right throughout the novel.
Wow, that's interesting. So. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. Pandemic is certainly not a new word, and I think that's probably one reason it didn't come to the fore for the American Dialect Society, because there's a little bit more of a focus on new words. But even for the dictionaries, it's not a new word. Peter tweeted about pandemic in 2009. People know about the 1918 flu pandemic. So interesting, very interesting point.
If I may, I think this is an example of a kind of, so there are all of the most significant kinds of language change that we see are often the least sexy. So everyone's always looking out for the neologisms and wants to talk about those, but there are all these subtle things that are actually much more profound. And I think that example you just gave, Elizabeth, is such a great anecdote to reveal the category of language change that is migration from domain specific into the general lexicon. And that's something that happened so much this year. R number, I mean, these just crazy epidemiology words that now all of us know, super spreader. There's a really large category this year that we saw moving out of that domain specific lexicon and into the general lexicon.
Mm-hmm. So let's, I was able to go to, not only did I do the American Dialect Society thing, Atlas Obscura did an event with Lynne Murphy, which is terrific. And Lynne looked at some of the words of the year, did sort of review of some of the great words around the world. But also Lynne every year does a crossover word of the year, British English to American English and American English to British English. One year I suggested ginger because my kids were using ginger a lot after reading the Harry Potter books. So Lynne, can you come on? And there she is, and tell us what were the two crossover words for this year?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear everybody talking about how the world, was focused on one thing this year, because we all were focused on one thing. But what interested me was the words weren't necessarily global words, so when you look at the different dictionaries doing their words of the year, I mean, pandemic, yes, everybody used pandemic, but it was Cambridge and Lexico, which have strong US presences, that had quarantine. Collins in the UK had lockdown. The Australian National Dictionary Centre had ISO for isolation. And that just reflects that we were all doing the same thing and using 3 different words for it. So at the same time as we're all coming together, what's been really striking to me is how little transfer there's been this year. We didn't get any Italian words out of the Italians' experience of the pandemic first. The only thing I can think of from China that we got was wet market. You know, so it's been interesting how in our own worlds we've been at the same time as the world's been falling apart. So it was hard this year for me to do a UK to US word, because in the last few years, I've had a harder time the other way around. I felt like Britain had reached peak Americanization, but America was just gobbling up all these British words. But this year that changed. So the words that I had been on my radar as possible words of the year didn't pan out. And what we ended up with the UK to US word of the year was jab, a word that only started really appearing in American newspapers in December when Britain went ahead with vaccinating people. So that's my little cautionary tale to all of the dictionaries that declare their words of the year in November, that sometimes interesting things can happen in December. But so that direction, it was really
Tell
hard.
that to our publicity departments, Lynne.
They
They need a longer lead time.
Yeah. But oh well. So I did it earlier this year. I usually wait till after Christmas to do mine, but I did mine early because of the Atlas Obscura thing. And so there it was the watchers of the Atlas Obscura event who got to vote, and they voted for jab. Now, whether it just remains a word that's used when talking about things happening in Britain, or whether Americans start to use jab themselves is another matter. I don't have great faith that Americans will use jab for themselves, but as has already been mentioned, lexicographers are rubbish prognosticators. They're good recorders. My American to British word of the year, we had a lot of choice there, one of which was lockdown, which British people don't have the sense of lockdown is what you do when there's a gunman loose, because there's never a gunman loose here. So it was an easier word to take on as something new that you do, because people weren't using the word already. But I didn't choose lockdown. I chose furlough because just everybody was nominating it. So furlough is an old word in English, but the meaning of it to not work because there's no money to pay you sort of meaning, that comes from America, as well as a few other words for it. So that was a word that was used greatly in Britain these days, as so many people had to go unpaid, and the government had a scheme for paying them. So I think we're probably seeing a new development in that meaning here, where furlough becomes the government paying you instead of your employer paying you. But we'll see how that one goes. Yeah.
All right. So really quick, let's do a couple more things because we're just about out of time. I don't think we have anybody wanting to speak from the room. So that's good. But if you do, jump in. There were some great international words of the year. I'd just like to ask any of our panelists plus two, what was your favorite non-English word of the year? Lynne?
I have one
Okay.
to start things off. We had a special category of Zoom-related words for 2020. We add new categories for the American Dialect Society vote when warranted, and certainly there were so many Zoom words that were that came up because we were living our lives on Zoom so much. The ultimate winner was "You're muted," when the refrain to get someone to unmute. But my favorite in that category was a Yiddishism, or a Yiddish. We could call it Yinglish, I suppose, because it combines Yiddish and English, and that's "Ois gesummt," which is formed in Yiddish, but with Zoom as the base word of it. And so in Yiddish, that would mean zoomed out. You're fatigued by overexposure to Zoom. And so I just like the expressiveness of ausgezoomt.
Mm-hmm.
I've got
Anybody
one.
else?
Well, we did, dictionary.com does Lexico's Word of the Year in conjunction with the lexicography from Oxford, Conversation for a Different Day. And we chose quarantine, as Lynn Murphy mentioned. We also offered a Spanish language translation of it. And some research one of our Spanish editors did was she detected a wonderful Spanish language blend of the Spanish for quarantine, which is cuarentena, and the Spanish for sadness, pena, and blended properly in Spanish that becomes, if I recall correctly, cuarentena, which is quarantine sadness or quarantine depression, or the feeling we had all this year of everything being shut down. So it was neat to see the Spanish equivalent of quarantine, and a blending action as well, ever productive, not just in English, but apparently in Spanish as well.
Mm-hmm. And Lynn, you raised your hand.
Well, my favorite is baby elephant, which is which is the Austrian word of the year, because they had a new baby elephant in the zoo, and the baby elephant was how far you need to stay away from other people in public. So I liked baby elephant. The other one I liked, I'm not pronouncing these right, but knuffelcontact in Flanders in Belgium, which is your hug buddy, your snuggle buddy, because everybody was allowed a snuggle buddy during their life.
You have the people in your household, but then you're also allowed one other person to come in as your cuddle contact, right? Is probably the close direct translation. That was my favorite, cuddle contact. How can you not love that as a word of the year? Really quick, Ben, you mentioned we said we get back to the American Dialect Society does all sorts of categories. You know, all the organizations do beyond just the single word. Ben, were there some you like to just really quickly highlight that were a personal interest in those categories?
Sure. Most useful is always a great category. And that was one by Before Times, or the Before Times, the way that we refer to the time before the beginning of the pandemic in this kind of dystopian fashion, beating out other terms like Blur's Day, another one of my favorites.
Oh, yeah.
When you don't even know what day of the week it is, well, it's Blur's Day. Doom scrolling came up before. That was our choice for digital word of the year. And that's obsessively scanning social media and websites for bad news. By the end of the year, especially with the election, some people were looking for a more hopeful, optimistic term. And so they came up with things like glee surfing, for instance, glee surfing. Was that glee freshing? That was the best alternative. That was glee freshing, if you're looking for the refreshing alternative. We also had the Rona as the winner in the slang/informal category. So this playful term for coronavirus, that's one of the many ways that we saw linguistic innovation going on this year. All the different ways people came up with to refer to coronavirus and its effects. And so sometimes that was the Rona, or it could be personified as Miss Rona, Aunt Rona. So many different variations on that theme as well. We even picked an emoji of the year, as we do some years, and this time it was the face with medical mask as the emoji of the year, which also kind of, sums up what we're all going through.
Okay. There's one question I forgot we didn't get to, and I'll just ask this. I'm not sure who in the chat asked it. I'm sorry, we're just rushing out of time here, but the spelling of COVID. So COVID-19 is the official name that the WHO gave this, and it's simply a shortening of coronavirus 19, coronavirus disease, 19 is where you get the D in there. How do we style it? Anybody want to tackle that?
I looked into that just because I wrote my Wall Street Journal column on COVID recently because it was word of the year. Wall Street Journal, like the New York Times, like CNN, goes with capital C COVID for, and the rest lowercase for COVID or COVID-19. That's because both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times say acronyms of that length, 5 letters or more, should have that style. Various other news outlets like the LA Times, USA Today, and the major networks go with all caps for COVID. And Washington Post, interestingly, is the only major news outlet that I know of that styles it all lowercase. Even the C is lowercase, as the Washington Post has it. And I think eventually that will be the style we all use, because that's often what happens with acronyms like laser or other things that become common, that we just lose all capitalization.
That's awfully quick, though, isn't it, to lose the capital?
And there are 5 variants at the Merriam-Webster entry, so that account for all of those. And that's because that's a reflection of the fact that it had to be put up before there was enough usage to determine really, where it's going to stand. So the privileged form is the all cap form, which was the initial one, but that may well change, for obvious reasons.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to have to say that's enough, because we can't expect people to stay here all night, but this has been lots of fun. So many words. Ben, Peter, John, Katherine, and Wendalyn, and Lynne, and Elizabeth, who weighed in, contributed. Thank you all very much for coming. In a couple of weeks, we're going to go a different way. We're going to go, we have a guest who's going to talk about building an editorial business, and should be interesting, but it'll also be our first guest from Australia, so that's very exciting. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.